Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Rebel Clash, you can go ahead and check out the Potown store and get yourself a nice 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are looking at the other poster boy from Darkness Ablaze. In the Post Rotation format, this is going to be Centiskorch VMAX. We all know how good these Welder decks have been since its release, and this Centiskorch seems to be probably the most promising VMAX we've seen in the fire type. So let's jump into the basic concept now. And honestly, the VMAX blows me away. It's a really, really strong card, very flexible, which I think is awesome. You can put your opponent in sort of clock situations where if the Centiskorch isn't dealt with, it can threaten an extra burst of like 120 damage the following turn. So the longer Centiskorch isn't dealt with, the more it grows and becomes a bigger threat on the board, which is really, really cool. And that flexibility is also really helpful because you can take like tempo early game knockouts if you want to on one prizes with Centiskorch because it just has that 2 energy attack cost. So you can play very differently with Centiskorch based on what sort of matchup you're against. So that damage output being flexible is actually like a really, really big deal. What I also like is oftentimes going second with this deck means that you can try and use Volcanion's Flare Starter attack early on in addition to Welder, and you get a bunch of energies into play. We've seen it with like Greenzard, how oftentimes they would choose to go second recently, and it just puts you in a really good spot. Either you can commit it all to one Centiskorch, you can split it between two, you can try and put it all across your board to try and work in that Heatran GX as well. So yeah, really nice just getting that flood of energies going early on, and it's an approach that we will often take. And what's also really cool about this, for one of the first times with a Welder deck, is that you don't need to hit Welder every single turn, because Centiskorch can, you know, power himself up at times from the discard pile, which is pretty cool, and you're at the very least doing something for just 2 energy attachments, so that can see you through the game as well. Especially if you're up against lower hit point stuff. You can go for some 2-hit KO plays and build like a big bench Centiskorch for the late game, or you can go out swinging in the early game trying to get big damage immediately, like I said, with the Volcanion and the Welder plays, and then in the late game you can sort of slow things down with like a mid to late Centiskorch, like the second one hopefully, that sort of gets you over the line. So yeah, tons to enjoy about this card. The list, as always, is going to be fairly straightforward. I try to do the same thing all the time when it's looking at a new set. So we're maxing out the copies of Centiskorch V and the VMAX. The regular V actually has one very interesting attack in Burning Emissions. For just 1 fire, you do 20, and you can discard one from this Pokemon. And if you discard, if you choose to discard, your opponent has to do the same on their active. So it can actually put a bit of pressure on what your opponent has left in the active position. Now, I still expect a decent amount of Jirachi to be played in the format, so it's going to be a little bit niche, but there are definitely situations where you can just remove your opponent's early game attachment, and obviously we have Welder on our own end, and we have Gmax Centinferno, which can accelerate from the discard pile, so sometimes that's a very good deal for the Burning Emissions. Also, you have the Burning Train, which is 180 for 4. Not exactly super efficient, but when you can Welder attach, it could maybe be something that you do to set yourself up to finish off a knockout, maybe after a Centinferno, something like that. So something to bear in mind. But mostly it's about that VMAX here, 320 hit point fire type with the Gmax Centinferno attack. For 2 colorless energies, you do 40 plus 40 more times the number of fire energy attached to this guy, and then you get to attach a fire from a discard pile to this Pokemon after you've calculated that damage. So if you just have that requisite 2, you're doing 120, and you get to go ahead and put an energy on at the end, so then the following turn, you've got that 160 already banked, as long as you don't get knocked out, and you can shove another 120 on top of that as well. So you can see quite quickly how this can get pretty out of control, which is really, really awesome. It definitely punishes your opponent trying to use things like boss's orders. They basically always have to look at the Centiskorch in front of them and start dealing with it when they can, because otherwise it really does just scale ridiculously, which is very cool. We then have the supporting cast of 3 copies of Stellar Wish Jirachi. I still find it's very useful for digging out those Welders in the early turns, digging out Giant Hearths. We are still combo based, and these Jirachis really help out. Also, seeing as though we don't have great search for VMAXs, I just like having a physically reasonable sized Pokemon count so that we have com access a lot of the time. So Jirachi is still a good lead for us, getting those early pieces. and is also a great way around stamp and stuff like that, because that can still be a headache in this post-rotation format. Those 3 copies of Volcanion, obviously a big deal to have a decently high count of this, so you can find it in the early turns, whilst committing ball search to, you know, your Dedennes and Centiskorch Vs and stuff. So I like having a physically high count. Also, the physically high count is very nice because this is your Decidueye answer with that high heat blast attack. Also, that high heat blast can be a nice way of getting through some Jirachis and a few other things here and there, some one prize cards, so definitely a nice option to have this Vulcan here to do that sort of trade-off 1-for-1. We have 1 copy of Heatran GX. That Hot Burn GX attack is excellent when you have Centiskorch self-accelerating in addition to your Welders. We play a very high switch count already because of the Stellar Wishes that we have going on here, so we can just lay that Heatran down, come in and have big Hot Burn GX attack turns, which can be absolutely excellent. You also have that Steaming Stomp attack if you just want to do the requisite 3 with a 2-prize Pokemon instead. We also have 1 copy of Eldegoss V. We play a couple 2-count supporters in addition to the 4 Welders themselves, so having a kind of flexible ability with the Eldegoss is very cool. I have thought about playing Mewtwo in here as well, but we're currently not maxing out the scoop up net count, so I figured Eldegoss for instant access was probably going to be more important. And we are playing 2 copies of Dedenne GX to help us push towards those Welders, push toward the VMAXs, basically just give us additional draw, seeing as though Welder is only a draw 3. Onto the trainers, we have 2 copies of Pokegear to give us better access to Welder, something that we've seen in a bunch of the sort of Welder toolbox lists pre-rotation, and I'm sort of taking that same approach again. We have the 4 Pokecom and the 4 Quick Ball as our main means of search. Hopefully the 4 Com and the 4 physical copies of the Centi VMAX gives us good access to this guy, because he is still what makes the deck tick at the end of the day. We have a lot of switch outs so that we can get into our Volcanion early and obviously move our Jirachis out the way as well. So we're maxing out the 4 switch as well as having a couple additional scoop nets to get them out of the way. We're playing 1 cheeky copy of the Wondrous Labyrinth Prism Star, seeing as though we only have a 2 energy attack cost on Centiskorch, and naturally after a Welder and attach we're already like way above that. We rarely do get punished by putting Wondrous Labyrinth into play, but it can sometimes force a lot out of opponents. If you've dealt with an Eternatus, or if you've you know, knocked out ADP before it's been able to use Ultimate Ray, you can definitely make life difficult for opponents and buy yourself a turn of attacking. And like I said, when Centiskorch is left untamed, he really does get like ridiculous. So I honestly see Wondrous Labyrinth as like a win condition in 1 card. It makes your opponent replace the stadium immediately. We also have 3 copies of Giant Hearth. It's nice to have extra activators for the discard pile alongside your Quick Balls and your Researchers and your Dedennes, because Centiskorch also likes to attach fire from the discard pile with his own attack, so having a lot of discard energy for fire energy is still very useful. That's why you'll see the high Hearth and also a high physical fire energy count in this list. And of course, Hearth thins the deck, gets you those Welder activations, is just an excellent card in general. For supporters, we are playing 2 copies of Boss. We really are hoping that Dedenne is still one of the bigger cards in the format, as well as Eldegoss, because obviously you hit that for weakness as well. Because 160 is a really, really easy number for you to hit with Centiskorch, because you have the 120 base on the GMAX Centinferno, and then that extra energy that you can like put onto yourself afterwards is very easy to do. So bossing up those guys can be easy. Not always the easiest to hit even things like Crobat for that 180 unless you're adding in Welders. So it's not like the most useful card in this deck, but it can be nice for picking off things that you've hit previously, or like I said, those 160 hit point or the Eldegoss that has fire weakness. You can definitely capitalize on those. The Researchers just giving you that little bit of extra dig, because at the end of the day, just hitting that VMAX is like so important. It's a really big deal. You can almost think of it as half a Welder, because the Centinferno gives you 1 energy. So the Research dig is definitely nice in here. I'm not playing a much higher count because I still think that Pokegearing towards Welders more often than not is a better option. But having a couple flexible options in here just to get a bigger hand size is also pretty nice. But it's still mostly about hitting your Welders and getting a bunch of energies into play. The Welder effectively counts as 80 damage for you, whilst also drawing 3 cards. And also just having that Heatran activation around as well is always pretty great. So Welder still the focal point of this deck. And the energy count is actually super simple. There is a special fire energy in the set, but at the moment I am just playing raw basics because I am hugely of the opinion that you want to always have Welder live, and you always want to have physical basic fires in your discard pile as quickly as possible, so you're always cashing in on that secondary effect of the Centinferno because it's extra damage, and damage is actually super integral against opposing VMAX decks. If you're the one missing out on a Welder, or if you're the one missing out on that discard energy attachment, you do start falling behind a lot. So I really do think these energies are pretty crucial for me. So here's the full list. You can screenshot now if you want to. It's also going to be in the description as always. But let's talk about some tech options. You may notice that this has been like probably the most streamlined list that I've seen out there right now, and that's probably because I've cut all of the healing defensive tools that are often attributed to this deck, and personally, I'm pretty petrified of Marnie in the format. I think Marnie is going to be like a 4-of in a lot of decks that aren't Welder-based. And it feels like these Hyperpots, these Malolanas, they're all just like so hopeful that you can get them used on the right turn. And ultimately, we're not able to spam Jirachi as much as we used to be because we don't have a skateboard anymore. And we're still just drawing 3 cards from Welder most of the time. So we don't actually have the most draw power out of like a lot of decks to actually take advantage of these cards. Now, that said, I have seen some decent success with lists from Japan that do have these healing traits. So something to bear in mind. And I actually do really like Big Charm. I think Big Charm's my favorite of the 4 cards I've put here. Because sometimes it lets you go more all-in with your Flare starter in the early turns if you are able to access that Big Charm early, because you can stay out of range of things like Zacian attacks and stuff like that if they're just trying to tempo out on you. But ultimately, I think the Big Charm and the Heat Fire, they kind of go hand in hand. It's not really ideal to play just one of them. But yeah, that Heat Fire, it's a decent card. The main reason I'm not playing it is I'm also seeing a decent number of Eternatus lists playing Dangerous Drill, and I think you insta-lose the game as soon as you start getting your energies removed from you. Not only are you losing that hit points, but you're losing your damage output, and it can even push you out of a 2-shot against Eternatus. So yeah, I'm pretty petrified of Drill, so at the moment I'm playing just raw basics, in addition to the fact that you just want to hit your Welders all the time. There's some other things you can play in that sort of fire toolbox that we've seen in the past. I have tried a 9 Temptations option in here with no boss at all and just trying to say I will hit Welder every turn. But I have found it's a real strain on your resources in terms of the fire energies. I've actually run out a couple times if I've had to dead change away a fire crystal here or there. So I think you certainly would have to play like 3 fire crystal probably if you are weaving in that Ninetales and you're basically just cutting those bosses' orders. I do think it's reasonable because I've not found boss to be like mind-blowingly good in this deck. It's one of those things that you can weave in at times. And the Ninetales does give you that slight extra option, but do bear in mind that most of the time your ball search in the early turns is always committed towards Centiskorch and then the VMAX, and then probably your next Centiskorch and your next VMAX. So you just kind of have to draw into the Ninetales at any point to actually get value from it. So that's why we're not playing that. Also, the Victini V also seems pretty interesting. Energy Burst could be good, possibly even in mirror match situations, which is fun, and gives you an additional option of getting some energies around the board. At the moment, I'm valuing the 3 Volks quite highly, because I'm expecting things like Decidueye out the gate to be a deck, and even things like a high Zamazenta count in even ADP lists are going to play probably 1 to 2. So having more easy options around that could be interesting, so something to bear in mind. Like I said, I have tried that Mewtwo over Eldegoss. If you play a higher count of Scoopnet, that definitely becomes viable. You could even try adding in the Oranguru. But like I just said with the Ninetales, almost always your ball search is committed to the Centiskorches first. So that's why we've not gone down that route. And finally, there's just a couple defensive cards that we're really not playing. There's the healing stuff that I'm already not playing, but then there's also the reset stamp that is really your only comeback mechanic, and currently we're playing none. We're just hoping to draw good as many games as possible. And there's also the option of Giant Bomb, and I actually think Giant Bomb could be critical for the Eternatus matchup. I feel like right now, even this straightforward streamlined list is a little unfavored against Eternatus. Because you're just a little underpowered against them. I feel you don't quite have easy numbers to get yourself into a 2-shot even against the 340 hit points of that Centiskorch, or sorry, of the Eternatus. So having a little extra Giant Bomb here and there can really put a shift in. to put some extra damage counters on those guys and whittle them down quite a lot. At the moment, I think some of the best options are trying to weave in that Wondrous Labyrinth and stuff like that, but Giant Bombs could certainly help out as well. For the matchup overview, I've really only said that Eternatus and a couple water decks are the ones that I'm concerned about. Against other 1 prizes, you have 3 Volcanions, so that's a decent amount to sort of trade on them as you go, and then try and plant one big one big Centiskorch at any point. The water stuff will be awkward, obviously. We've got easy answers to Zamazenta and to Decidueye, which are really the 2 big headaches for Eternatus right now. So as long as we figure out that Eternatus matchup, and as long as Frostmoth doesn't get hugely popular to sort of counter the Senti players, I think it certainly looks to be a reasonable archetype in my opinion. My closing thoughts are that the matchup spread's really good for Centiskorch. I'm pretty much not worried of queuing into anyone with this deck, other than Eternatus and the water decks. And water at the moment is super fringe. Frostmoth hasn't done anything yet, so we'll see how Post Rotation treats the Moth. At the moment, I feel like it's not that we can't beat Eternatus, I just feel like you actually have to make some big Welder plays and not miss them throughout the entire game. They make you draw the best out of most of the other decks, I would say, to keep up with them, because they just have such good raw stats. They're hitting very strong numbers, and they have 340, which is a lot of health to get through. So yeah, I think the matchup spread looks very decent, so I can see Centiskorch just sticking around for a good amount of time. What I will say, though, is this list is potentially almost too simplistic, in that I may not have enough greed in here, enough defensive options as well. So working in some bombs, working in some stamps, and possibly taking the risk and cutting some consistency potentially for some healing cards could also be the case. So let me know what you guys think about Centiskorch. How has the healing stuff gone for you so far? Are you a big fan of making that hit points just a way higher number? How often has it been helpful to you? I will hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow for another Darkness Ablaze deck. Cheers.